The Lighthouse of Runestone Bay. The lighthouse at Runestone Bay was less a building and more a feature of the landscape, an extension of the granite headland upon which it stood. It grew from a plinth of ancient stones, massive, sea-smoothed boulders that predated any written history of the village huddled in the bay's protective curve. These were the runestones that gave the bay its name, their surfaces covered in deep, winding grooves that the villagers, in their quiet, fearful reverence, never touched. The lighthouse itself was squat and powerful, built of the same gray stone, its lamp a single, unwavering eye that had guided the fishing fleet home for 5 generations. Its keeper was Hallgrim, a man as weathered and as silent as the stones themselves. He was soft-spoken to the point of seeming mute, his movements economical and precise, honed by 30 years of solitary duty. His hands, though, were surprisingly gentle, whether he was polishing the great Fresnel lens until it shone like a captured star or tending to the small, hardy garden he cultivated in the lee of the tower. He had arrived at Runestone Bay as a young man, seeking refuge from a world that had proven too loud and too complicated, and had found a quiet purpose in the lighthouse's cyclical, ordered life. The turning of the lamp, the logging of the weather, the winding of the clockwork mechanism, these were his liturgy, and he was its faithful priest. The locals in the village below regarded him with a mixture of respect and pity. He was Hallgrim the Keeper, a permanent fixture, as reliable as the tides. They left offerings of fresh bread, salted fish, and occasionally a bottle of potent, homebrewed ale at the base of the path that led to his door, but they rarely climbed it. They didn't need to. Hallgrim had never, not in 3 decades, missed a lighting. They whispered stories about the lighthouse, especially when the winter storms rolled in from the unforgiving northern sea. They said the runes on the foundation were a ward, a powerful magic laid down by the first settlers to keep the horrors of the deep, the draugr, the sea spirits, the great krakens that haunted sailors' nightmares at bay. The lighthouse beam, they believed, was not just a guide for ships, but a beacon that strengthened the ancient magic, keeping the village safe. Hallgrim, in their minds, was not just a keeper of the light, he was the guardian of the seals. He heard the whispers on his rare trips to the village for supplies, and he never corrected them. He did not know if the tales were true, but he knew the sea was vast and full of mysteries, and a little healthy fear was a sensible thing. His life was one of peace, of a solitude so complete it had become a form of companionship. The cry of the gulls, the crash of the waves, the low hum of the wind against the lantern glass, this was his conversation. He was content. Until the night the storm came. It was a storm unlike any other in his memory, or in the meticulous, leather-bound logbooks of his predecessors. It did not roll in from the north, but seemed to rise from the sea itself, a wall of churning, black cloud that swallowed the horizon in minutes. The wind shrieked, a high, mournful keen that vibrated through the stone of the tower. Rain came down not in drops, but in horizontal sheets that hammered against the lantern glass with the force of thrown gravel. Hallgrim went about his duties with his usual calm precision, checking the seals on the glass, ensuring the clockwork mechanism that turned the lamp was fully wound, its steady, rhythmic ticking a small anchor of order in the raging chaos. He stood by the great lens, his hand resting lightly on its brass frame, and watched the beam slice through the maelstrom, a defiant finger of light against an angry god's fist. Then, 2 things happened at once, so contrary to the laws of nature that they momentarily shattered Hallgrim's composure. First, a low, resonant hum began to vibrate up through the floor, through the very soles of his boots. It was a sound he felt as much as heard, a deep, powerful thrumming that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the lighthouse. He looked down, through the thick glass of the service hatch that led to the lower levels, and saw an impossible sight. The runestones at the base of the tower were glowing. A faint, ethereal blue light pulsed from within the ancient carvings, outlining the winding, interlocking symbols in shimmering fire. The second event was even more terrifying. Outside, the sea, which had been a churning cauldron of mountainous waves and crashing foam, went utterly, preternaturally still. The wind vanished. The rain stopped as if a tap had been turned off. One moment, the world was a symphony of chaotic violence. The next, it was shrouded in a silence more profound and more menacing than the storm had ever been. The surface of Runestone Bay became a sheet of black, unmoving glass, reflecting the single, steady beam of the lighthouse in a perfect, unwavering line. Hallgrim's heart hammered against his ribs. The old tales, the whispers of the villagers, flooded his mind. The runes were glowing. The sea had been silenced. Something ancient and powerful had awoken. He was the keeper, the guardian. And he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. For a long while, Hallgrim did nothing but stand and stare, his mind struggling to process the impossible reality before him. The blue light from the foundation stones cast strange, dancing shadows up the winding staircase, and the profound silence from the world outside was a crushing weight. He was a man of order, of predictable mechanics and observable weather patterns. This was something else entirely. This was the world of saga and myth, crashing into his quiet, rational life. Slowly, his training and discipline reasserted themselves. A keeper's first duty is to investigate any anomaly. He lit a heavy oil lantern, its warm, yellow light a small comfort against the cold, alien blue, and began his descent. The stone steps were cold under his worn boots, and the humming grew stronger with every step downwards, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to settle in his chest. He reached the ground floor, the main entrance room where he kept his oilskins and coils of rope. The blue light was brighter here, pouring through the thick, iron-banded oak door. He unlatched it and pulled. It swung open onto the stone plinth, and he stepped out into the unnaturally still night. The air was cold and heavy with the smell of ozone and brine. The runestones were blazing now, the intricate carvings pulsing with a steady, rhythmic light, like a great, slow heartbeat. The symbols were complex, unlike the simple runes he had seen in books. They were loops and whorls, sharp-angled lattices and deep, flowing grooves, all interconnected, a single, massive seal carved across a dozen boulders. Hesitantly, driven by an impulse he didn't understand, Hallgrim reached out and laid his palm flat against the largest of the stones, the one directly beneath the doorframe. The stone was not cold, but strangely warm, and the vibration flowed directly into his arm, a powerful but not unpleasant current. And then the voice came. It was not a sound. It did not travel to his ears. It bloomed, fully formed, inside his skull, a voice woven from the pressure of the deep ocean, the slow grind of tectonic plates, and a loneliness so vast and so ancient it stole his breath. Silence. The word was a sigh of immense relief, a release from a pain that had lasted for millennia. Hallgrim snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling away from the stone, his heart pounding. He had heard of shell-shocked sailors hearing voices, of solitary men going mad from the isolation. But this was no trick of a weary mind. This was real. The lock weakens, the cage rests, the voice continued, slower this time, as if gathering strength. So long in the shouting dark. Hallgrim stared at the glowing stone, his mind reeling. The legends were true. The runes were a seal, a lock. And he was speaking to the prisoner. He scrambled back inside, slamming the heavy door shut, as if the oak and iron could block out a voice that spoke inside his own head. He leaned against the door, his breath coming in ragged gasps. For the rest of the night, he did not sleep. He sat at the small, sturdy desk in his living quarters, the keeper's logbooks spread out before him. These books were his Bible, a continuous record stretching back over a century and a half. He searched for any mention of glowing runes, of a silent sea, of a voice. He found nothing direct. The entries were mostly mundane, weather reports, shipping movements, maintenance notes. But as he delved deeper into the older books with their spidery, faded script, he found hints. Keeper Arnevald, 70 years prior, wrote of a winter of unquiet tides and fish nets coming up strangely empty. He noted a low hum from the foundation stones on the night of the new moon, which he dismissed as a trick of the wind. Further back, in a logbook from the lighthouse's first keeper, a man named Magnus, the entries were more cryptic. Magnus wrote not of weather, but of the bay's temper. He described the construction of the lighthouse, noting that the first builders, his own great-grandparents, had insisted it be built upon the old stones, for they were the anchor of the shore. One entry, dated on the winter solstice of the first year of the light, was particularly chilling. The lamp is lit. The watch is set. May he sleep peacefully in his deep cradle and trouble our shores no more. His search left him with more questions than answers. The prisoner was real. The seal was real. And according to Magnus' log, the lighthouse itself was part of the watch. The next morning, the world outside was deceptively normal. The sun rose, the sea had regained its gentle swell, and the gulls cried for their breakfast. The runes no longer glowed. But the silence in Hallgrim's mind was now an absence, a space where the voice had been. He knew it was still there, waiting. He needed to know more. There was only one person in the village who might hold the key to stories older than any logbook. He put on his oilskins, left a note on his door, a habit, though no one ever came looking for him, and began the long walk down the winding path to the village of Runestone Bay to seek out old Hilda. Hilda's cottage was at the far end of the village, nestled against the rising slope of the fjord where the sea pinks grew thickest. It was a place of memory, its walls built of driftwood and its roof thatched with reeds, every inch of its interior crammed with the flotsam and jetsam of a long life lived by the sea, nets and glass floats, whalebone carvings, and shelves overflowing with books that smelled of salt and old paper. Hilda herself was as ancient and as weathered as her home. Her face was a road map of wrinkles, but her eyes, the pale gray blue of a winter sea, were sharp and missed nothing. She was the village's unofficial historian, the keeper of the old ways and the old tales that were now mostly dismissed by the younger generation with their diesel engines and talk of weather forecasts from the capital. She looked up from the net she was mending as Hallgrim stooped to enter her low doorway, and a rare, knowing smile touched her lips. Hallgrim Keeper, it takes a strange tide to bring you down from your rock. Sit. The kettle is on. Hallgrim sat on a low stool, the warmth of her small peat fire a welcome comfort. He was not a man for pleasantries, and Hilda did not expect them. He got straight to the point. The runes, he said, his voice raspy. I need to know about the runes. Hilda's nimble fingers did not stop their work, but her eyes narrowed slightly. The runes have kept their silence for a long time. Has something disturbed them? They glowed last night, Hallgrim said simply, during the storm, and the sea went silent. Hilda put down her netting shuttle, her full attention now on him. She breathed, a sound of ancient understanding. So the loch weakens. I had wondered. The fishing has been poor these last years. The heart of the bay grows cold. What is the loch, Hilda? What is it holding? Not what, she corrected gently. Who? Or what passes for a who in a being as old as the sea itself? We have called it many things. The Fjord W.I.R.N. The Tidefather. The old books, the ones my grandfather saved from the fire at the old monastery, they call it Juffager. The Deep Mind. She rose and shuffled to a heavy sea chest in the corner. From it, she carefully lifted a large, leather-bound book, its cover bare of any title. She laid it on the table between them, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. She opened it to a drawing, a crude but powerful image in faded ink. It depicted a creature of immense size, a being of swirling tentacles and a single, vast, intelligent eye, rising from the waves as small, terrified figures in boats fled before it. Jeffiker was not always a prisoner, Hilda explained, her finger tracing the edge of the image. In the beginning, it was the life of the bay. Its thoughts were the tides. Its breath was the wind. The first people to settle here, they worshipped it. It gave them bounty. The fish would leap into their nets. The weather was calm. The bay was a paradise. What changed? Hallgrim asked, his eyes fixed on the terrifying drawing. We did, she said sadly. We grew greedy. We took too much. We built bigger boats. We hunted the whales that were its companions. We angered it. The paradise became a place of terror. Storms scoured the land. Great waves dragged boats into the depths. The Fjord Wirem, once our provider, became our destroyer. She turned the page. The next image showed a group of figures standing on the headland, their arms raised. Before them, the great beast was being pulled down into the waves by glowing, ethereal ropes that seemed to spring from the very stones they stood upon. The first keepers were not of a lighthouse, but of the lore. They were the rune sealers. They knew the old magic, the language of the earth and the sea. They could not kill Jeffiker. To do so would be to kill the bay itself. So they did the only thing they could. They bound it. They wove its consciousness, its immense power, into a cage of runes, with the stones of the headland as the bars. They anchored its mind, put it to sleep, and silenced its rage. And the lighthouse? Hallgrim asked. The lighthouse is the key in the lock, Hilda said, meeting his gaze. The rune sealers knew their magic would not last forever. It needed a focus, a constant source of power to reinforce the seals. The rhythmic turning of the light, the constant presence of a human will, a keeper to maintain the watch, it all feeds the spell. It keeps the deep mind dreaming. Hallgrim felt a cold dread creep up his spine. His life's work, his quiet, ordered routine, was not just about guiding ships. It was about maintaining a mystical prison. Why is it weakening now? He asked. The magic is old, Hallgrim, and it was tied to the blood of the sealers. My grandmother was the last of that line. When she died, the last living link to the spell was broken. Since then, the lighthouse has been the only thing powering the runes. It has taken this long, but the power fades. The runes glow because the prisoner is waking up, and it is testing the bars of its cage. That evening, back in the solitude of his tower, Hallgrim felt the voice touch his mind again. It was clearer now, more focused. Keeper, you spoke with the echo of the sealers. Hallgrim stood at the lantern room window, looking out at the calm, dark water. I did, he whispered aloud. They have told you I am a monster, a destroyer. The old drawings show you as one, Hallgrim replied. A wave of profound, ancient sadness washed through his mind, so powerful it made him sway. When a part of your own body is wounded, does it not thrash in pain? When your children are slaughtered, do you not cry out in rage? The people of the shore, they were my children too. Their greed was a knife in my heart. My storms were not malice. They were agony. The voice was not that of a mindless beast. It was intelligent, articulate, and filled with a grief that dwarfed his own small, human sorrows. The seal does not just bind me, Keeper. It poisons me. It drains my life to power its own fading magic. The bay dies because I am dying. The fish are gone because my dreams are barren. The cage is killing the prisoner, and the jailer, and the entire land. What do you want? Hallgrim asked, his voice trembling. The seals are failing. Soon, they will shatter. When they do, my power, untethered and insane from millennia of torment, will be unleashed. The agony you saw in the old drawings will be a gentle rain compared to the hurricane of my release. The bay, the village, this entire coastline, it will be scoured clean. The voice paused, and Hallgrim felt a strange, terrifying shift in its tone. It was no longer pleading. It was offering a choice. But there is another way. The magic can be unmade. The heartstone of the seal, the master rune, can be broken by a mortal hand. If the lock is opened, not shattered, I can regain control. I can be whole again. The bay can live again. I offer you a covenant, Keeper. A partnership. Free me, and I will be your guardian. Let the seals break, and I will be your doom. Hallgrim stared out at the dark water, his mind a battlefield. He was caught between the terrifying legends of the past and the compelling, intelligent voice of the present. To trust the monster of the myths, or to trust the crumbling magic of the ancestors. The fate of Runestone Bay rested on his choice. And he knew, with a chilling certainty, that he did not have long to decide. The days that followed were a torment. Hallgrim existed in a state of heightened, anxious awareness, caught between two worlds. The physical world was one of routine, polishing the lens, winding the clockwork, noting the placid, almost lifeless state of the sea in his logbook. But the mental world was a constant, silent conversation with the ancient being in the deep. Jeffrey showed him things. It didn't just speak in words, but in visions, in feelings. It would push images into his mind, a vision of the bay as it once was, teeming with so much life that the water shimmered with the silver scales of vast shoals of herring. He saw whales, great, gentle leviathans, breaching in the deep channel, their songs echoing through the water. It was a vision of a vibrant, thriving paradise. Then, it would show him the present from its perspective. It showed him the runes as a network of burning, parasitic threads, burrowing into its consciousness, siphoning its energy. He felt a phantom sensation of its immense life force slowly bleeding away, leaving a cold, barren emptiness. He understood then why the fishing was failing. The bay was starving because its heart was being drained. Yet, the logbooks of his predecessors were a powerful counterargument. He spent hours poring over the brittle pages, especially the first keeper's journal. Magnus had documented the WIRM's rage in stark, terrifying detail. Another longboat lost today, smashed to splinters against the cliffs. Not by the storm, but by a single, deliberate wave. It plays with us as a cat plays with a mouse before the kill. Another entry read, "The sea itself has turned against us. The water is black and bitter. The fish we do catch are twisted, with clouded eyes and flesh that sickens the children. It is a curse, a plague of the deep." This was not the voice of agony Jeffrey described. This was the voice of malice. He was torn. Was Jeffrey lying, manipulating him with its honeyed words and visions of a lost paradise? Or had millennia of torment truly changed it? Or perhaps the truth was more complex, perhaps both accounts were true, different facets of the same ancient, powerful being. The village below was growing restless. The eerie calm of the sea was more unsettling than any storm. The fishermen took their boats out, but their nets came back empty, day after day. A strange anxiety settled over the community. They would gather on the shore at dusk, staring out at the lighthouse, as if expecting some answer from its silent keeper. Hallgrim could feel their eyes on him, a weight of expectation he had never known. One evening, Eric, a young, pragmatic fisherman who had recently taken over his father's boat, broke the unspoken rule and climbed the path to the lighthouse. He was a leader among the younger generation, a man who trusted diesel engines more than old legends. Hallgrim, he said, his voice respectful but firm, forgoing any greeting. The bay is dead. Old Hilda speaks of the fjord WIRM and weakening seals. The others, they are scared. They talk of abandoning the village. What is happening? Hallgrim looked at the young man's earnest, worried face. He could not tell him he was having conversations with the very creature of legend. The old magic is failing, he said, choosing his words carefully. The sea is out of balance. Can you fix it? Eric asked. You are the keeper. The legends say your work keeps the seals strong. "The legends are old," Hallgrim replied, his voice heavy with the burden of his secret. "And the magic is older still. I am looking for a solution." Eric left unsatisfied, and Hallgrim knew he had bought himself very little time. The village's fear was growing, and fear was a dangerous, unpredictable tide. That night, Jeffger's voice was more urgent than ever. "The threads are snapping, Keeper. I can feel them. The cage is coming apart. The pain is immense. Soon, I will not be able to speak. There will be only the rage." As if to punctuate its words, the rune beneath the lighthouse door flickered, its blue light sputtering like a dying candle. A tremor shook the tower, strong enough to rattle the lantern glass. Hallgrim knew a choice had to be made, and soon. He descended to the foundation, lantern in hand. He needed to find the Heartstone. He ran his hand over the glowing runes, one by one. Most felt the same, humming with a steady, fading warmth. But as he reached a large, flat stone near the back of the plinth, facing the open sea, he felt a difference. This stone was cold, ice cold, and the vibration it emitted was a frantic, high-pitched thrum. The rune carved upon it was the most complex of all, a knot of interlocking lines that seemed to be the central point from which all the others sprang. This was the Master Seal. This was the Heartstone. He stood before it, a heavy blacksmith's hammer from his toolbox clutched in his hand. He could end this, one way or another. He could strike the stone and trust the voice in his head, or he could do nothing and trust the crumbling magic of the ancestors. His hand trembled. The fate of the world he knew rested on this single, impossible choice. The second storm arrived without warning. The sky, which had been clear and starry, was suddenly blotted out by a swirling vortex of black cloud that converged directly above the lighthouse. There was no wind, no rain, only a terrifying, oppressive silence and the flickering of sheet lightning within the clouds. Then, the lighthouse lamp, which had burned faithfully for over a century, sputtered and died. The world was plunged into absolute darkness, broken only by the frantic, pulsing blue light of the dying runes. A new sound began, a high-pitched, grating shriek that seemed to come from the stones themselves. It was the sound of ancient magic tearing itself apart. One of the smaller runes on the far side of the plinth flared brilliantly, then went dark. A moment later, another followed. The seals were shattering. "It begins." Jeffger's voice was a mangled scream in his mind, a chorus of pain, rage, and terror. The agony. "I cannot hold. Break the Heartstone, mortal. It is the only way. Release me, or we all perish." Hallgrim stood frozen before the master rune, the hammer feeling impossibly heavy in his hand. Below, in the village, lights flickered to life. He could hear faint, panicked shouts carrying across the unnaturally still water. They had seen the light go out. They would be coming. His mind was a maelstrom of doubt. The Keeper's logs, the terrifying drawings, the warnings of the ancestors, they all screamed at him to trust the seals, to let them hold for as long as they could. But his own experience, the intelligent voice, the visions of a dying bay, the palpable sense of an ancient consciousness in torment, they pulled him in the other direction. He thought of the slow, creeping death of the bay, the empty nets, the worried face of Eric. The old magic was failing, trusting it was simply waiting for a slower, but just as certain doom. The only chance, the only path that was not a passive acceptance of destruction, was the one that required an act of faith. A covenant with the monster. Another rune went dark, and the shriek of tearing magic intensified. The entire tower groaned, and a crack appeared in the stone wall beside him. He made his choice. Hefting the heavy hammer, he swung it with all his strength. The blow struck the Heartstone with a deafening crack, a sound that was not just stone breaking, but a spell shattering. At that exact moment, a new sound reached him from the water, the rhythmic splash of oars. A longboat, a lantern hanging from its prow, was cutting through the black water, heading directly for him. Eric and a half-dozen other fishermen, their faces grim and determined in the lantern light, were coming to see what their keeper had done. They were about to find out. The instant the hammer shattered the heartstone, the world changed. It was not a loud, explosive event. It was a release of silent, immense pressure. A wave of pure energy, colorless and invisible, erupted from the lighthouse foundation, washing over Hallgrim without touching him. The frantic, blue glow of the remaining runes vanished, plunging the headland into absolute darkness. The high-pitched shriek of failing magic was replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the end of the world. The sea, which had been as flat and still as polished obsidian, responded. The entire surface of Runestone Bay rose as one, not in a chaotic, crashing wave, but in a single, perfectly smooth, colossal swell. It was a mountain of black water, its crest rising higher and higher, dwarfing the lighthouse, threatening to swallow the village whole. From the longboat, Eric and his men could only stare upwards in mute terror, their oars frozen in the water. They saw the monstrous, silent wall of water looming over their homes, a liquid apocalypse. They looked to the lighthouse and saw Hallgrim alone, dark figure standing amidst the dead runes, illuminated by the single lantern on their prow. But the wave did not break. It held its impossible form, a liquid cliff hanging in the night, the water within it swirling with a newfound, deep-sea phosphorescence, galaxies of faint, blue-green light. The storm clouds overhead, which had been a churning vortex simply, dissolved, vanishing in an instant to reveal a sky full of brilliant, cold stars. And in Hallgrim's mind, the voice of Jeffrey spoke one last time. It was no longer a pained whisper or a desperate scream. It was a voice as vast and as calm as the cosmos, filled with the power of the restored ocean. The balance is restored. The covenant is made. Thank you, Keeper. As the last word echoed in his mind, the great wave receded. It did not crash upon the shore, but flowed backwards as gently as it had risen, settling back into the bay with a sigh that stirred the air like a soft breeze. The sea was no longer unnaturally still, but alive with the gentle, rhythmic swell of a healthy tide. High above, in the lantern room of the lighthouse, the great lamp reignited itself. But the beam was different. It was no longer the steady, mechanical yellow light of burning oil. It was a brilliant, silver-white light, as pure and as powerful as moonlight, and it swept across a sea that was suddenly, miraculously, teeming with life. Eric and his men watched, dumbfounded, as the water around their boat began to boil with activity. A massive shoal of herring, a river of silver, rushed past them towards the shore. A pod of dolphins, creatures not seen in the bay for 50 years, leaped from the water, their sleek bodies arcing in the new, silver light. The air, which had been heavy and stagnant, was now fresh and alive with the clean, sharp scent of a living sea. They looked from the miraculous sea to the lighthouse and to the keeper standing at its base. Hallgrim was no longer just the quiet, solitary man who tended the light. He was something else. A man who had spoken to the sea and commanded a miracle. Their fear was replaced by a profound, jaw-dropping awe. In the weeks and months that followed, Runestone Bay was reborn. The fishing was not just good. It was legendary. The nets came up heavy with cod, herring, and mackerel. The old lobster pots, long abandoned, were suddenly full. The village, which had been on the brink of despair, thrived. The whispers about Hallgrim changed. They no longer spoke of him with pity, but with a hushed reverence. He was Hallgrim's sea friend, the keeper of the covenant. He continued his duties, but they were different now. The lighthouse no longer felt like a prison ward. It felt like a watchtower for a friend. He still polished the lens and kept the log, but his solitude was no longer empty. It was filled with a constant, quiet companionship. He He would stand at the lantern room window and feel the calm, ancient consciousness of Jeff brushing against his own, a silent conversation of shared vigilance. He learned the moods of the bay not from his instruments, but from the feelings projected by the deep mind. The runes on the foundation stones were now just old, weathered carvings, their magic gone, their purpose fulfilled. The protection they offered was no longer needed, for the bay was no longer a prisoner. The relationship between the people of the shore and the spirit of the deep had been transformed from one of fear and domination to one of respect and symbiosis. Hallgrim rarely went to the village now, but he didn't need to. Eric and the others would leave their offerings, not of simple sustenance, but the best of their catch, a tribute to the keeper and the ancient guardian he had awakened. His life was still quiet, still ordered, but it was no longer small. He was the keeper of the light, the fulcrum of a covenant between humanity and the sea, a solitary man who had made a choice, and in doing so, had saved his world by trusting the monster of the deep. He was home,